FactCheck.org and PolitiFact are two of the nation's most prominent fact-checking organizations. They claim to be nonpartisan. They claim to be honest brokers aiming to separate political rhetoric from the facts. PolitiFact even won a Pulitzer Prize. Unfortunately, in reality, fact-checking sites generate much of the fake news they complain about. Staffed by journalists who lean left, they go easy on claims made by liberals and apply heightened scrutiny to claims made by conservatives. The most egregious example? Even when a Republican and a Democrat say the same thing, the fact-checkers can come to a different conclusion. For example, in 2012, Republican Ron Paul claimed the U.S. federal income tax rate was 0% until 1913. PolitiFact rated that claim half true. In 2015, Democrat Jim Webb made the exact same claim. PolitiFact rated his claim mostly true. These organizations also go well beyond what they're expected to do, attempting to fact-check subjective political rhetoric that shouldn't be fact-checked. Let's go back to just before Election Day 2016, when many in the media were feeling self-satisfied. They thought that they had painted Republican Donald Trump as a liar and proven that Democrat standard-bearer Hillary Clinton was truthful. PolitiFact founder Bill Adair wrote, "Is this the post-truth election as people have claimed? No. It's actually the thank goodness they're fact-checkers election." The public disagreed. It turns out Americans trust the fact-checkers as little as they trust politicians. A Rasmussen poll before Election Day found that 62% of likely voters believe media fact-checking just skews the facts to help candidates they support. The evidence bears out this view. FactCheck.org said that Donald Trump's claim that Hillary has pledged totally open borders was false, even though she said in a private speech that it was her dream to create a hemispheric common market with open trade and open borders. FactCheck.org tried to explain that away by providing the Clinton talking point that the context for that claim was energy policy. But open borders are clearly open borders regardless of context. FactCheck.org also ruled Donald Trump's claim that Hillary Clinton wants to double down on Obamacare, making it even more expensive, false, because Clinton had said she wanted to make health care cheaper. FactCheck took Clinton's opinion at her word without bothering to consider what Clinton's proposed health care policies would actually do to prices. Meanwhile, on PolitiFact, claims from Hillary Clinton that were clearly false were bumped up to half true. PolitiFact rated as half true her claim that what I have put forward does not add a penny to the debt, even after acknowledging that government policy under her leadership would add $9 trillion to the debt over 10 years. A Media Research Center analysis in June found that Trump got the false, mostly false, pants on fire labels from PolitiFact's Truthometer 77% of the time. Clinton got just false, mostly false, for 26% of her statements. From September through Election Day, Republicans overall got a pants on fire ranking 28 times, and Democrats got it only 4 times. Catching politicians in a lie is a worthy endeavor. Fact-checking isn't the problem. The problem is the subjectivity involved in selecting what gets fact-checked, and by what means. Opinions get disguised as fact-checking. While some truths are absolute and beyond dispute, there are matters more in the realm of political opinions that can't easily be sorted into baskets marked true or false. That's what political debates are about. Even PolitiFact's Adair admitted the rankings are subjective, saying, "Yeah, we're human. We're making subjective decisions. Lord knows a decision about a Truthometer rating is entirely subjective." When even PolitiFact employees recognize not everything is black or white, it's time to take the fact out of PolitiFact and see the major fact-checking websites as what they are, purveyors of opinion journalism, not final arbiters of objective truth. Liberal journalist Ben Smith wrote 5 years ago that fact-checkers are doing opinion journalism under pseudo-scientific banners, something that's really corrosive to actual journalism. What was true 5 years ago is probably even more true today. If you liked this video, please click the links on your right to read the full story on our website and subscribe to us on YouTube, and check out the description below to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. Thanks for watching.
My great-uncle was killed in a shootout with police. It was devastating to our family. When people talk about the anguish of losing a family member in a confrontation with the authorities, well, I get that. When people are highly suspicious of the circumstances, when they just can't bring themselves to believe their loved one did something that would justify what happened, when their minds turn to conspiracies and police wrongdoing, that's a normal human reaction to tragedy. But no matter how much we empathize, we as a society must look at each case and ask what really happened. You can look to the facts, or you can be politically correct. Most people think political correctness is just an effort to avoid giving offense, and that the worst it can do is stifle debate. It's true it does that, but in fact, political correctness is much more sinister. It's a form of deception. The term has its origin among communists who believed that truth was whatever served the cause of the party and its patron, the Soviet Union. Pravda, translation truth, was, as you may recall, the name of the Communist Party's official newspaper in the Soviet Union. Everyone knew the paper was full of lies, yet in the communist sense, it was indeed truthful. It told the tales that advanced the cause. Let's take a look at one of the worst practitioners of political correctness in recent history, Al Sharpton. The Reverend Al became a national figure in 1987 after Tawana Brawley, a 15-year-old African-American girl, was discovered in a garbage bag, smeared in feces and with racial epithets written on her body in charcoal. Brawley claimed to have been raped by 6 white men, some of whom were police officers. Sharpton led protests and accused several individuals of involvement in the crime, including a prosecutor. He called New York Governor Mario Cuomo a racist and compared State Attorney General Robert Abrams to Hitler. Brawley's supporters suggested that the Mafia, the KKK, and the Irish Republican Army may have been involved. A grand jury looked at 250 exhibits and heard from 180 witnesses, more than 6,000 pages of testimony, and concluded that the whole thing was a hoax. Brawley had apparently written the epithets on herself, upside down, and smeared herself with waste from a neighbor's dog. Nobody knows for sure how the story got started, but apparently Brawley had defied her stepfather to see her boyfriend and was afraid of being punished by her stepfather, who had killed his first wife. Then, as the story gathered momentum, there was money to be had from lawsuits. Her mother later declared, "We should be millionaires." Plus, there's the fame and other rewards that often fall upon a supposed victim whose story advances a political cause. Despite the evidence, Sharpton continued to push the story. This is what political correctness looks like. It doesn't matter if the facts are true, so long as the narrative is important. In 1990, Sharpton supported a boycott of Korean-owned groceries in Brooklyn. During the boycott, a teenager smashed an Asian-American man's skull with a claw hammer, while onlookers chanted, "Koreans go home." The man was actually Vietnamese. Later, after a Hasidic Jew accidentally killed a black child in a car accident, Sharpton spoke at the child's funeral. He said that diamond merchants had blood of innocent babies on their hands and, quote, "If the Jews want to get it on, tell them to pin their yarmulkes back and come over to my house." In the riots inspired by Sharpton, 43 civilians and 152 police officers were injured, and a rabbinical student died with rioters chanting, "Kill the Jew." Then there was Freddy's Fashion Mart. Its landlord, who was black, raised the rent, and Freddy's passed along the rent increase to a black-owned music store. Sharpton called it racism, attacking the, quote, "white interloper." Protesters, inspired by Sharpton, yelled, "Burn down the Jew store." One of the protesters then shot 4 employees of Freddy's and set the store on fire. Finally, there's what happened in Ferguson, Missouri. The facts are that Michael Brown, age 18, robbed a convenience store. He roughed up an Indian-American store clerk half his size and walked away. Some 10 minutes later, Brown was confronted by a police officer, Darren Wilson, who was on the lookout for the robbery suspect. Brown assaulted Wilson and attempted to take the officer's gun, which discharged inside the police car. Brown, 6'4" and almost 300 pounds, ran, then turned around and charged the officer. Following investigation by the Obama Justice Department, the police officer was found to have been entirely justified in shooting Brown. The Justice Department examined all the witnesses, and those whose stories stood up to scrutiny, all African American, all backed up Wilson's version of events. Yet the tale spread that Brown was shot while holding up his hands in surrender, a story that originated with Brown's accomplice in the robbery, who was running away and didn't even actually see the fatal shot fired. Sharpton decided to get involved. He and his associates turned the hands up, don't shoot gesture into a symbol for alleged police abuses. It appeared in that context on national magazine covers, was replicated by performers at the Grammy Awards, was seen at Democratic Party meetings and countless protests, and became part of the national culture. Sharpton's reaction, ignoring the facts of the case, helped to stir up anti-police sentiment. 2 St. Louis area police officers were shot in revenge for Brown's death but survived. In New York City, 2 police officers were shot to death in revenge for the Ferguson incident and for the death of Eric Garner. In Houston, a sheriff's deputy was shot execution style while pumping gas. 5 officers killed in Dallas. Baton Rouge, 6 officers shot, 3 of whom died. Overall, in the first half of 2016, the number of police officers shot and killed up 44%. Today, despite all the lies, Sharpton is a major respected figure in American politics. He has a show on MSNBC. Democratic presidential candidates are expected to campaign at his church. The current and previous attorneys general have spoken at his events, as have Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, and President Obama. The magazine Politico declared Sharpton, quote, Obama's go-to man on race. Let's be clear. There was a time when police were sometimes the enemies of African Americans. Black men in the South were framed for crimes so they could be used as prison labor. Basically, that was an attempt to reconstitute slavery. There were police officers like Itchy Trigger Finger Nash in Georgia, who got an award from the KKK for killing blacks. And there were the officers in Mississippi who helped murder civil rights workers Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney. Unfortunately, I could go on and on. Suspicion of police in the African American community is completely understandable. But today, the percentage of police shooting deaths of African Americans is lower than the percentage of murders committed by African Americans and lower than the percentage of African Americans who are murder victims. 4 recent studies support the belief that in similar situations, police are now less likely to shoot or use lethal violence against an African American compared to someone in a different group. Again, with what happened to my family, I take the issue very seriously. My heart breaks for anyone who loses a loved one that way. However, as a journalist and a citizen, I want the narrative determined by the facts, never the other way around. When a PC narrative becomes the primary method of viewing the world, it can lead to dangerous false judgments of innocent people and lots of violence. Al Sharpton has demonstrated for us how this happens time and time again. If you like this video, please click the link on your right to read the full article on our website. Subscribe to us on YouTube, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen. Thanks for watching.
Hi, I'm Matthew Vadum here on behalf of Clint Carson to talk about his article about the Union of Concerned Scientists. Back in the 1980s, the endless left-wing maligning of Ronald Reagan's SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, painted a cartoonish picture of the president's efforts to defend the United States from nuclear attack from our communist enemy, the Soviet Union. They mocked it by calling it Star Wars, referencing the movie. Many of those heaping undeserved ridicule on the plan belonged to an organization founded in 1969 called the Union of Concerned Scientists, or UCS. Anti-military scientists and engineers, along with other so-called progressives, created this group that grew out of protests at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and other schools across the nation. Since 1969, UCS has been at the forefront of the politicization of science, even though it is not an organization of scientists. Anyone willing to pay $35 can join. One person even signed up his dog to drive the point home. The dog, Kenji, received a welcome kit and a signed letter from the president of UCS. And yet the media often quotes this group of laymen and activists as if it were a scientific rather than a political organization. Since its founding, UCS has agitated and relentlessly churned out propaganda, pushing the United States to disarm and adopt a nuclear no-first-use policy. Think of someone telling you it makes no sense, or is provocative even, to take steps to defend yourself from potential harm, or insure yourself against it. Boiled down, these are the arguments of UCS against missile defense and the possession of strategic nuclear weapons as a deterrent to possible attack. The principle of no first use in nuclear weapons policy parlance is a nation-state's promise not to use nuclear weapons except in retaliation for nuclear attack. It amounts to a pledge not to start a nuclear war. Less charitably, it is a national suicide pact. As with many progressive tropes, the idea sounds noble, if not the very bare minimum standard for decent, civilized society. Of course, in the real world, it is insanity. In addition to their destructive power, nuclear weapons are incredibly useful as a deterrent to any attack, whether it be nuclear or non-nuclear or conventional attacks. Pledging no first use also requires the generous assumption that other nuclear-armed countries will be similarly restrained, which is a risky proposition in an age of nuclear proliferation. UCS has predictably promoted aggressive nuclear disarmament with barely any concern for verification or compliance by U.S. treaty or agreement partners, while simultaneously propounding the notion that it is this very nuclear arsenal that obviates missile defenses. In saying more needs to be done to slash America's nuclear arsenal, UCS does not identify a minimum threshold for a U.S. nuclear deterrent. Does it even have one? UCS's funding comes from many foundations, but the major contributors to its nuclear and global security programs are the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Energy Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, the Plowshares Fund, and the Tides Foundation. For nearly the last half-century, the Union of Concerned Scientists has openly promoted an anti-military, anti-nuclear weapons, and anti-strategic defense agenda. It argues these forces pose dire threats to the environment and divert from efforts that could otherwise be devoted towards so-called social programs. Likewise, UCS's sources of funding, totaling in the tens of millions of dollars since 1998 alone, derive from radical left-wing foundations and groups dedicated to environmental, social justice, and nuclear disarmament agendas. Given his progressive policies, it should be no surprise that President Obama's strategic nuclear and defense policy and arms control agenda overlaps with UCS's programs. However, with his policy disagreements with the Republican Congress, culminating in 2016 in a standoff over missile defense policy and funding, along with a veto threat, Americans should fully understand the source of his commitments to these issues. Recent North Korean nuclear tests and the emergence of nuclear first-use policy in the first presidential debate between candidates Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump have given these issues further urgency. UCS and its funders openly embrace a progressive agenda that for the last 8 years has been advanced by the Obama administration. Is that policy coincidental, or is its objective to downgrade nuclear forces and missile defenses in favor of the UCS's so-called environmental and social priorities? If you liked this video, please click the link on your right to read the full story on our website, subscribe to us on YouTube, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. Thanks for watching. Hi, I'm Matthew Vadum, here on behalf of Alec Torres to talk about his article about Citizen Engagement Laboratory. The left dominates in the war of ideas by using foot soldiers and community organizing generals to generate publicity for their cause and to force their enemies into submission. Let's take a look at a nonprofit organization called Citizen Engagement Laboratory. A well-funded group with donors such as radical billionaire speculator George Soros, it aims to cultivate other left-wing groups to agitate for left-wing causes, from climate change to diversity to anti-right-wing religious advocacy. These left-wingers want to fundamentally change the way we think about America, and not for the better. In 2014, they produced a documentary television series called America by the Numbers, which celebrated the projected decline of whites as the majority group in the United States in coming decades. The series claimed to be documenting the human faces of the biggest population change in U.S. history as a growing number of Asians, Latinos, African Americans, mixed race, immigrants, women, youth, and LGBT are becoming the new American mainstream, influencing elections, culture, commerce, and every facet of contemporary life. Of course, there is nothing wrong with pluralism and the vibrancy it brings to American society, but there's a lot wrong with thinking of people solely in terms of identity politics and the ethno-cultural and demographic groups to which they belong. Citizen Engagement Laboratory pushes this highly divisive, balkanized, far-left view of an American populated by hyphenated Americans. They encourage Americans to think of themselves in terms of their sex, sexual preference, race, ethnicity, and national origin. They discourage Americans from thinking of themselves as Americans first. Americans should be proud of their culture and Western civilization. They don't need to be ghettoizing themselves or looking abroad for inspiration. America is where it's at. Citizen Engagement Laboratory also promotes open borders, granting amnesty for illegal aliens, even though such policies have already served as a magnet drawing tens of millions of illegal aliens to the U.S. In 2011, these people founded a group called Culture Strike to stop a common-sense Arizona law making it a state-level misdemeanor for an illegal alien to be present in Arizona without proper documentation. The law was very popular in Arizona because the federal government was refusing to enforce immigration law and secure the border. Residents of Arizona were sick and tired of the never-ending influx of illegal aliens destroying their farmland, boosting local crime rates, and becoming a burden on the state's social safety net. Faithful America is another group Citizen Engagement Laboratory created. Their motto is "Love thy neighbor, no exceptions." Yet they pressured Catholic University of America to refuse a grant from the Charles Koch Foundation for the study of principled entrepreneurship, fought to force Hobby Lobby to violate its religious conscience rights, and pressured MSNBC to stop inviting Family Research Council President Tony Perkins onto shows where he would advocate for the religious beliefs of his stakeholders. Citizen Engagement Laboratory's Education Fund supports progressive commentator Sally Kohn, who openly embraces outlawing thought with which she disagrees. She said it's a good thing if conservatives feel unable to express their views for fear of facing hostility from their peers or professors. If they feel like they can no longer speak against positive social change, good, Kohn said. Yes, she actually said that during a debate at the University of Missouri. Think about that while you still can. Safeguarding America's future means protecting the ideas that made this country great. That's why it is so important for those who disagree with what Citizen Engagement Laboratory is doing to speak out, because that group's supporters are loud, and we need to be louder. Fight for free speech, fight for law and order, and fight against the emerging leftist form of racism and sexism. If you liked this video, please click the link on your right to read the full article on our website. Subscribe to us on YouTube, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. Thanks for watching.
Hi, I'm Melody Bowler, speaking on behalf of Kevin Boyd, who wrote our article on disaster relief. Both at home and abroad, government is the major provider of disaster relief. But what's their track record? And might there be a better system to help those most in need of relief? Recall Hurricane Katrina. The city had an evacuation plan for those without cars, but it fell apart very quickly. There weren't enough buses for those who wanted to leave, yet district school buses were left idle to flood in the storm. Provisions for evacuating patients out of nursing homes completely fell apart. so many patients were killed in the storm and its aftermath. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, housed the homeless in trailers, but many had toxic levels of formaldehyde in them. Once the storm had passed, even the recovery process was an absolute nightmare, bogged down in red tape. The government program, Road Home, was intended to give grants to those who wanted to fix up their homes or buy out those who wanted to leave, but it was run as a crony capitalist scheme. The company contracted to run the program, ICF International, spent $912 million of taxpayer-funded relief aid on overhead. Many homeowners didn't have their cases resolved for years. The government's handling of Katrina was a mess and a tragedy, teaching the residents of Louisiana to neither wait for nor trust the government's help. When disaster struck Louisiana again, residents helped each other instead. In August, a severe tropical rainstorm sat over Baton Rouge and dropped so much rain that homes and entire towns that had never flooded before were destroyed. 13 people were killed, with damage estimated at $8.7 billion. People found themselves trapped in their homes. They called 911, but the local and parish first responders were unable to cope with the magnitude of the situation and often didn't have the resources to respond. But a flotilla of private boats, which came to be known as the Cajun Navy, was able to step up and respond to help their neighbors. Supporting this ad hoc rescue effort was a volunteer network powered by modern technology. If someone needed to be rescued, they would go into a Facebook group and request pickup. The Cajun Navy also monitored police and other first responder radio bands. Instead of waiting on the Red Cross and the state government to establish shelters, local volunteers went to work themselves. Churches and Louisiana's largest film studio were converted into emergency shelters. Walmart proved to be a miracle worker. The corporation had its on-staff meteorologists give constant weather updates to determine where trucks needed to be. The company was able to shift deliveries from nearby distribution centers and stores to the disaster area and prioritize deliveries of important products like water and baby formula. The lesson out of Louisiana is that the private sector can provide immediate disaster relief in a timelier manner than the government can. In most cases, all that's needed to empower ordinary people is keeping government out of the way. When government expands, it crowds out civil society and the private sector. This can be a problem, especially in a disaster. If you liked this video, please click the link on your right to read the full article on our website, subscribe to us on YouTube, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. Thanks for watching!
When you hear the terms unemployment rate, poverty, and race, it sounds like you're hearing a straightforward concept you can base a discussion on. But what you don't know is, these terms don't actually mean what you think they do. Government and media have slyly worked together to frame American political discourse by using language in a way aimed at convincing you to get on their side about controversial issues, rather than actually communicating facts. Does it sound unbelievable that the American public could be misled so easily? Let's look at some concrete examples. There's the unemployment rate. The Bureau of Labor Statistics uses two surveys, one of households, the other of businesses, to determine the unemployment rate. Just determine the number of potential job holders and the number of actual job holders and do a little math and you've got the unemployment rate, right? Not exactly. Do you count inmates in jails and prisons? How about people who do temp work, or those who work 10 hours a week, or those on furlough? Do you count people who are only passively looking for work? How about people who have completely given up looking for work? The answers to those questions determine the unemployment rate, or I should say the unemployment rates. The government actually has 6. Right now, the unemployment rate that's usually reported to the public looks pretty good, 4.9% as of this recording. But when you calculate in the people who've quit looking for work, it's pretty bad. So when you hear people say that the unemployment rate is rigged, well, it's complicated, but they do have a point. The poverty rate? That's even worse, because the poverty rate is largely arbitrary. By setting the criteria, the definition of poverty, bureaucrats can make the poverty rate as high or as low as they want and get away with it. I'm not saying there's no such thing as poverty. Poverty exists, but beauty and ugliness exist too. Imagine if someone reported that this month, the number of beautiful people in the U.S. increased from 10.1% to 10.2%, a difference of 1 person in 1,000. You'd say that's nuts. No one can make such a determination, especially down to 1 person in 1,000. Yet that's the sort of thing the government does with the poverty rate. Poverty exists, it just can't be scientifically measured. So the government produces numbers that are a combination of sociology and baloney, and those numbers are used to determine the amount of spending on government program after government program. Over decades, bureaucrats have actually raised the poverty line, typically by about 1% a year after adjusting for inflation. Thus, people you've never heard of, who were never elected by anyone, and aren't accountable to anyone, get to decide who's eligible for government programs based on income, and who gets government subsidies, and how much those subsidies are, on Obamacare, for example. And they make a lot of other decisions that were supposed to be done through the democratic process. And there's the big one, race. A total scam. Racial categories were created to oppress people, and that's how they're used today. They have no basis in science, no basis in cultural anthropology or physical anthropology or genetics. Even the American Anthropological Association, which was largely founded to promote racism, admits now that it's nonsense. Yet our government and our academic institutions and our politicians are obsessed with putting people into categories that make no sense. You can say that there's one race or many thousands of ethnicities and subcultures, but if you try to put people in a small number of categories, say white and black and Latino and other, or white and people of color, or any similar scheme, well, you're just making it up. People from Syria and Lebanon used to be classified as white. People from Ireland were called black. Jews from Europe were considered a mentally deficient race, according to the so-called science of the day. And the Latino group, combining people whose ancestors came from Mexico, Brazil, El Salvador, Cuba, the U.S. Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, and many other places, people who have very little in common with each other, that seemingly ancient category was actually concocted by the Census Bureau when I was in college. Carcinogen, renewable energy, inflation, and assault weapons are all much more complex than they seem as well. Next time you hear one of these terms or any other suspicious concept, listen carefully and make sure you're actually having the conversation you think you are. If we're going to move forward as a nation, we need to concern ourselves with facts, not words that are, at their heart, meaningless. It's not the unemployment rate that's important, it's the number of people who don't have jobs but want them. It's not racism that's important, it's bigotry towards any group based on meaningless physical characteristics. If we can think objectively, we can start to fix the problems plaguing our world. But in the hands of the Washington bureaucracy, ill-defined terms become things of wax to shape as they please. If you liked this video, please click the link on your right to our website, subscribe to us on YouTube, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen. Thanks for watching.
Hi, I'm Matthew Vadum here on behalf of Andrew Herod to talk about his article, Keeping Up with CAIR's Islamic Radicalism. Capital Research Center has reported before on the Council on American-Islamic Relations and its close ties to the world of Islamic terrorism. But for those unfamiliar with it, CAIR poses as a civil rights group for Muslim Americans. CAIR claims its mission is to enhance understanding of Islam, encourage dialogue, protect civil liberties, empower American Muslims, and build coalitions that promote justice and mutual understanding. But that is not actually what CAIR does. CAIR was founded in 1994 by 3 men linked to the Islamic Association for Palestine, which was created to serve as the public relations and recruitment arm for Hamas in the United States. Hamas is recognized by the U.S. Department of State as a foreign terrorist organization, and CAIR members have claimed that Muslims have no other choice but to commit suicide bombing attacks against Israel. Ghassan El-Ashi, a co-founder of the Texas branch of CAIR, was convicted of terrorism-related offenses and sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. CAIR Civil Rights Director Randall Todd Royer got 20 years in prison for federal weapons and explosives convictions. CAIR board member Abdurrahman Alamoudi was sentenced to 23 years for funneling $1 million to al-Qaeda. In the aftermath of 9/11, CAIR refused to blame Osama bin Laden for those terrorist attacks that claimed 3,000 American lives. In 1998, CAIR denied bin Laden was responsible for 2 al-Qaeda bombings of U.S. embassies in Africa. The group argued improbably that the bombings resulted from misunderstandings of both sides. The same year, CAIR objected to a Los Angeles billboard that called bin Laden the sworn enemy, claiming it was offensive to Muslims. CAIR's ties to terrorists are recognized by both parties on Capitol Hill. Democratic Senator Dick Durbin from Illinois has said CAIR is unusual in its extreme rhetoric and its associations with groups that are suspect. Republican Congresswoman Sue Myrick from North Carolina said, groups like CAIR have a proven record of senior officials being indicted and either imprisoned or deported from the United States. Despite this, in 1,400 years of documented Islamic expansionism and violence, CAIR officials paint an unjustifiably rosy picture of modern Islam. Like President Obama, CAIR claims Islam is a religion of peace and that terrorists and those who support them are just a tiny sliver of the Muslim population. CAIR's website proclaims that several scholarly works suggest that Islam is not the cause of terrorism. Jailani Hussain, the executive director of CAIR's Minnesota chapter, actually had the gall to argue during a terrorism case that jihad did not mean holy war. Faizan Syed, executive director of CAIR's branch in St. Louis, Missouri, said, in America, the greatest threat to any American is right-wing extremism. While some recognize the threat it poses to America, CAIR still has far too many allies in power. Democratic Congresswoman Jen Schakowsky of Illinois complained in December of 2015 that even talking about Muslim terrorism is, in her words, really frightening to her Muslim constituents, and that Republican words are somehow terrorizing Americans. CAIR believes that Islamic Sharia law, under which women are treated like property, should be superior to the U.S. Constitution. If we are practicing Muslims, we are above the law of the land, Mustafa Carroll, executive director of CAIR Dallas-Fort Worth, said in 2013. In Missouri, Faizan Syed once appealed online to Muslims to report anti-Islamic and anti-Muslim content on the internet to appropriate authorities. Take actions according to the Sharia. Given Sharia's death penalty for blasphemy, his call could have lethal implications depending upon where Muslims worldwide heeded it. CAIR members applauded the attack on a cartoon exhibit in Garland, Texas in 2015 that invited artists to depict the Muslim prophet Muhammad, something forbidden by Islam. They said that this kind of free speech was actually hate speech and an incitement to violence. This is not a good argument, given that the only people who resort to violence when Islam is supposedly insulted are Muslims. This dangerous ideology presents a threat both to American civil society and U.S. national security. But many Americans are afraid of calling out CAIR and the corrosive brand of Islam it promotes. They are afraid of being called names. They are afraid of being called bigots and racists. If we want to be able to have an honest conversation about how to keep our nation safe, that means taking the facts as they lie and recognizing that Islamic aggression and terrorism are real things we shouldn't be afraid to talk about. If you liked this video, please click the link on your right to read the full article on our website. Subscribe to us on YouTube, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. Thanks for watching. Hi, I'm Matthew Vadum, Senior Vice President and Editor at the Capital Research Center, here on behalf of Neil Magami to discuss his article, Architects of Disaster, the White House's Iran Treaty Echo Chamber. In April 2015, the Obama administration pushed through a one-sided nuclear non-proliferation pact with the Islamic Republic of Iran, the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. U.S. officials did this even as Iranian officials openly mocked them. Iran is a country that hosts Death to America and Death to Israel rallies every single day. Somehow the Obama administration convinced people that the totalitarian, theocratic regime in Iran could be America's friend. How did they do it? How could public opinion be swayed to strengthen this brutal regime? The answer? Money funded the relentless repetition of lies. President Obama's speechwriter, Ben Rhodes, bragged about it to the New York Times. Rhodes came up with legions of arms control experts who began popping up at think tanks and on social media, and they became key sources for hundreds of often clueless reporters. We created an echo chamber. They were saying things that validated what we had given them to say. The Dangerous Plowshares Fund played a big role in greasing the mainstream media's skids. The San Francisco-based Arms Control Foundation handed out grants to several nonprofits in the national security community, which helped create the echo chamber Rhodes mentioned. Who might be in that echo chamber? According to journalist Eli Lake, lots of people. He reports that Plowshares' messaging work got underway in 2011, long before Rhodes started reaching out to left-wing groups to mainstream their narrative. Lake reports that Plowshares and its grantees formed something called the Iran Strategy Group. The group developed a sophisticated campaign to reshape the national narrative on Iran. That campaign smeared skeptics of diplomacy as pro-war and downplayed the dangers of Iran's nuclear program before formal negotiations started in 2013. The campaign then emphasized those dangers after the agreement was reached in 2015. The strategy group, which included representatives of the Arms Control Association, the National Security Network, the National Iranian-American Council, the Federation of American Scientists, the Atlantic Council, and others, executed a strategy to implement the Iran campaign. Plowshares, which partners with the Institute for Policy Studies, Code Pink, J Street, and United for Peace and Justice, spent $4 million in the 5 years before 2016 to push the Iran deal and coordinated with the so-called peace groups and think tanks on its payroll to support the negotiations. What did those Plowshares-funded groups have to say about the agreement? Most were delighted with it. The Arms Control Association called it a historic milestone that strengthens the non-proliferation regime. The Atlantic Council quoted former U.S. diplomat R. Nicholas Burns, saying the deal was a historic achievement that will freeze Iran's nuclear efforts. Plowshares has also given National Public Radio, NPR, at least $450,000 since 2006. Two of the grants worth $250,000 were earmarked for Iran-related topics. NPR claims the money in no way influenced its softball news treatment of the nuclear issue. They certainly got what they paid for. The organizations they funded told the world what their donors wanted them to. Plowshares took a dangerous White House proposal that threatens our national security and generated the paid expert opinion necessary to sell it to the American people. Just how closely was all this coordinated directly with the White House or through plugged-in political operatives linked to the White House? We don't have all the facts yet, but when we do, at least this is certain. Americans may take a much different view of the Iran Treaty and of the pundits, political leaders, media outlets, organizations, and foundations that pressed for its approval. To learn more, please click the link on your right to the full story on our website. If you like this video, please subscribe to us on YouTube, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. Thanks for watching.
Hi, I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen, Vice President and Chief Investigative Officer at the Capitol Research Center. What do Sports Illustrated magazine, vampire movies, NASCAR, The X-Files, pina colada flavoring, and puns based on the expression "let it go" have in common? Why, they're all marketing aimed at children, of course. At least that's what some politicians in Washington and bureaucrats want you to believe. 2 years ago, senators held a hearing on how the companies that make and sell electronic cigarettes aim their advertising at kids. Senator Barbara Boxer accused the industry of targeting kids by putting flavors in their e-cigs, apparently basing her theory on the idea that adults want their e-cigs to be flavorless. One of those flavors targeting kids? Pina colada. Another example of supposed marketing targeting children? An e-cig logo on a women's bikini bottom in an ad in Sports Illustrated. Senators at the hearing also attacked the e-cig industry for targeting kids by placing an ad on the Super Bowl. Boxer also claimed that the manufacturers were targeting children with an ad that used the tagline, "Let it glow." How is that targeting children? Easy. The term "let it glow," you see, is similar to the term "let it go," which ties in with the song of that name that's featured in the movie Frozen, and Frozen is a cartoon and lots of kids sing that song. Hey, it's just logic, right? In the past, politicians and bureaucrats have accused companies of marketing various products to children with ads on TV shows like Baywatch and The X-Files, and with sponsorship of bikini contests and car races. These sorts of accusations were made against Big Tobacco. Now, let's be clear. Big Tobacco sold an addictive product that killed people and took taxpayers' money to do it. I'm not defending Big Tobacco, but I don't defend lying politicians and bureaucrats either. The charges against Big Tobacco largely focused on an advertising character named Smooth Character, but that came to be known as Joe Camel. The idea was that because Joe Camel appeared in cigarette ads and he was a cartoon, the ads were aimed at children. By that logic, the Michelin Man sells tires to children, Aaron E-Surance sells insurance to children, and Speedy Alka-Seltzer, the Sinclair Oil Dinosaur, Otto the Orkin Man, Ready Kilowatt, and the Budweiser Frogs are all cases of marketing to children. The Joe Camel ads featured such children's activities as playing saxophone in a jazz band and driving around in a convertible picking up chicks. The ads appeared in such children's publications as, yes, the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue and Playboy. Of course, the charge about Joe Camel being aimed at kids was rooted in a scientific study, one that reportedly showed more kids recognizing Joe Camel than Mickey Mouse. Funded by whom? Anti-smoking activists, of course. Conducted by researchers at the Medical College of Georgia and the Department of Family Medicine at the University of North Carolina, it purported to indicate the number of children who linked the Joe Camel character to cigarettes. Of a sample of 229 children, the authors found that the Mickey Mouse symbol had 91.7% recognition and Joe Camel had 51.1%. However, the authors decided to focus on 23 6-year-olds in the sample, a tiny size, because 21 of them, 91.3%, recognized Joe Camel. So what was the takeaway? More 6-year-olds recognized Joe Camel than Mickey Mouse, a selective distortion of the facts. The study was widely reported by the news media and was used to justify government policy on tobacco, policy that restricted advertising but ended up giving Big Tobacco a shared monopoly, protecting it from competition in return for lots of cash to the government and anti-tobacco groups. Today, politicians and bureaucrats and their media allies are attempting to do to e-cigs what they did to tobacco. In the case of tobacco, their targets largely deserved what happened to them, but as we've learned before, violators of the Constitution never stop at violating the rights of the bad guys. Eventually, using the same techniques of deception, they come for the rest of us. To learn more, please click the link on your right to the full story on our website. If you like this video, please subscribe to us on YouTube, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen. Thanks for watching.
Hi, I'm Melody Bowler, Director of Publications at the Capitol Research Center. For my article series, Doing Good, Effective Alternatives to the Welfare State, this month I interviewed Chenalyn Barker, a fellow member of the Capitol Research Center, about the Turkey Thicket Gardeners Association in northeastern Washington, D.C., which she co-founded. I expected to learn about how to create a community garden, the challenges of dealing with government bureaucracy, and the benefits that people receive from being a member of a community garden. To my surprise, I instead learned about what a community is, the cultivation that a community needs to exist, and the benefits received from living in and being part of a community. I'll let Chenelyn speak for herself.
Hello, I'm Chenelyn. Before we founded our garden, the lot that would become its home was simply empty concrete, like a parking lot without the car spaces. Next door was a nearly dilapidated playground. The community and the Department of Parks and Recreation got together to rebuild the playground. Simultaneously, when they were building the new playground, which I'm biased, I think is the best public park in Ward 5, they built the garden with the raised garden beds. But it wasn't exactly a home run for the DC government or the city. They decided to take the clay dirt from the playground to fill the garden boxes, which can be difficult to grow in. So we had to amend the dirt, or some chose to remove the dirt completely and refill the plots. But now it's done, and we're working toward integrating the garden into the community to help it flourish. That's what it's about. Government is not going to be able to do enough to help our communities. We have to get our problems solved as individual citizens to do what government cannot do for us. Eating fresh food should not be limited by your income. Everyone should be able to have fresh food in their backyard, and gardening is the simplest way to educate yourself about that. We just want to engage the community and provide them with the tools to educate themselves on where their food comes from, and finding low-cost, healthy alternatives that teach themselves self-responsibility as individuals and for their families. What I'm most proud of is that the garden brings people together. It holds us accountable to one another and provides us with the both tangible and intangible resources we could never get from government assistance. At this year's meet and greet, gardeners and the community members got a chance to meet each other. It seems simple, but it's just getting to know one another is the first step in creating a strong community. The TTGA has created a meeting place for all community members, which strengthens the bonds of the community by creating shared responsibility. When neighbors get to know each other and everyone uses public spaces, the entire neighborhood begins to feel like home, and people who are connected to the community treat their shared home with respect.
To learn more, please click the link on your right to the full story on our website. If you liked this video, please subscribe to us on YouTube, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. Thanks for watching.
Hi, I'm Matthew Vadum, Senior Vice President and Editor at the Capital Research Center, here on behalf of James Simpson to discuss his article, Black Lives Matter, Racist Provocation with Radical Roots. The Black Lives Matter movement casts itself as a spontaneous uprising born of inner-city frustrations, but that's not the whole story. The movement is the playground of a web of dangerous, well-funded radical organizations that have been agitating against the American system of government for decades. Black Lives Matter claims to be nonviolent. Its website says the Black Lives Matter network advocates for dignity, justice, and respect. Black activists have raised the call for an end to violence, not an escalation of it. But this is just a tactic, a false claim calculated to reduce public resistance to its hateful racist message and the violence its members routinely perpetrate. Crime had been trending down for decades, yet in 2015, as the movement's activism intensified, homicide rates increased dramatically. In Houston, homicides rose 25%, in Washington, D.C., 54%, Baltimore, 59%, Milwaukee, 73%, and in Cleveland, homicides jumped a whopping 90%. Overall, homicides increased 17% in the 50 largest cities, the greatest increase in 25 years. Black Lives Matter activists are routinely observed screaming obscenities, urging that police officers be murdered, and physically attacking police. For example, this past July, 21 police officers were injured by rocks, steel pipes, and fireworks during a demonstration in St. Paul, Minnesota, where protesters shut down the interstate for 5 hours. One officer suffered a spinal fracture after a concrete block was dropped on his head. At a Minnesota fair protest last summer, Black Lives Matter activists shouted, "Pigs in a blanket, fry 'em like bacon."
Pigs in a blanket, fry like bacon. Pigs in a blanket, fry like bacon. Pigs in a blanket, fry like bacon. Pigs in a blanket, fry like bacon.
Fueled by dishonest, sensationalized media reports about police-involved shootings, Black Lives Matter agitation has provoked numerous police killings, lawlessness, and unrest in minority communities throughout the United States, culminating most recently with the horrific ambush murders of 5 policemen in Dallas and 3 in Baton Rouge, with many more wounded. But why would a movement calling for an end to violence do such things? Because a simple desire to end police abuse, mind you, that has to varying extents plagued all law enforcement agencies everywhere since modern policing was invented, only scratches the surface of the frightening ideological lineage of Black Lives Matter. 3 activists claim credit for the creation of the Black Lives Matter slogan and hashtag: Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi. All of them are associated with the radical socialist left. Alicia Garza was executive director of an organization called POWER, which evolved from the now-defunct communist group STORM, Standing Together to Organize a Revolutionary Movement. STORM was an organization that hoped to foment revolution in America and whose members went to Cuba to support that country's brutal communist dictatorship. Patrisse Cullors was trained by Eric Mann, a former Weather Underground leader. For those too young to remember, the Weather Underground was a domestic terrorist group whose goal was to wage war against and overthrow the federal government. At a 2015 Netroots Nation conference, Cullors led chants shouting, "If I die in police custody, burn everything down, rise the fuck up. That is the only way motherfuckers like you will listen."
If I die in police custody, burn everything down. Burn everything down. Because no building is worth more than my life. Because no building is worth more than my life. And that's the only way motherfuckers like you listen.
Opal Tometi is executive director of Black Alliance for Just Immigration. Like many organizations that Garza and Cullors are associated with, Black Alliance for Just Immigration is actually a front group for something called the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, a descendant of the new communist movement inspired by Chinese dictator Mao Zedong and the many communist revolutions occurring throughout the world in the 1960s and 1970s. Of course, Black Lives Matter, just as all lives do. But the Black Lives Matter movement is about so much more than that, and people ought to know what its leaders truly stand for. If allowed to continue, Black Lives Matter agitation will bring greater civil unrest and anarchy. To learn more, please click the link on your right to the full story on our website. If you liked this video, please subscribe to us on YouTube, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. Thanks for watching.
Hi, I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen, Vice President and Chief Investigative Officer at the Capitol Research Center. Back in May, the Food and Drug Administration announced that it was assuming regulatory power over electronic cigarettes. The justification was that e-cigs are tobacco products, which the FDA has the legislative authority to regulate. The problem is, e-cigs don't actually contain tobacco. The FDA regulations ban sales to anyone under 18, but that was already being done in most states. And the regs impose all sorts of other restrictions on advertising, packaging, and so forth. Here's where big tobacco comes in. The regulations make virtually all e-cig products, even those currently on the market, subject to government approval. If they're not approved by bureaucrats, they're banned. The cost of approval for an e-cig product may be as high as $2 to $10 million per item. That's an impossible burden for an industry dominated by small manufacturers and shops. Of course, this approval process will be less damaging for big tobacco. Companies like Altria, formerly Philip Morris, Reynolds American, Imperial Brands. These megacorporations have their own versions of e-cigs, and they have the financial resources to cover the costs that small businesses can't afford. By the way, one of the people fighting to keep these regs is a member of Congress, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who recently resigned as Democratic Party chairman after she and her staff were caught colluding with the Hillary Clinton campaign to defeat Bernie Sanders. And while e-cigs are not perfectly safe, they're much less of a health threat than old-fashioned combustible cigarettes. Except for nicotine, users of e-cigs are exposed to none of the roughly 7,000 chemicals associated with real cigarettes. E-cigs contain none of the chemicals associated with emphysema, none of the 60 chemicals in cigarettes that are classified as cancer-causing agents. Public Health England, a government agency in the United Kingdom, concluded that e-cigs are 95% safer than cigarettes. The Royal Academy of Physicians reached the same conclusion. As e-cigs became more popular among teens in the U.S., their use of real cigarettes fell 42% in 4 years. What happens when you restrict e-cigs? Smoking rates among 12 to 17-year-olds increased in states that banned e-cig sales to minors, up almost 12%. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention under the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services refuted this by claiming that overall tobacco use by middle and high school students hasn't declined since 2011. You know how they reached that conclusion? They classified e-cigs, which contain no tobacco, as tobacco products. Bureaucrats? Lying? Who'd have thunk it? It's time our government starts thinking rationally about e-cigs and gets out of the way of proven harm reduction strategies, rather than continuing to protect big business and big tobacco. To learn more, please click the link on your right to the full story on our website. If you like this video, please subscribe to us on YouTube, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen. Thanks for watching.